I think we are just about ready to start. Hello, I'm Naomi Clayton. I'm Deputy Director at Learning and Work. And thank you for joining us for the last panel session of the day. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on the moment on the cost of living crisis, with new data showing that inflation has reached a 40-year high. In this session, we're going to focus on the slightly longer term picture and how we can grow our way out of current challenges and create a high-skill, high-wage economy. And that's no easy feat. The latest OBR forecasts show that prices will erode real wages and reduce living standards by 7% in total over the next 2 financial years, essentially wiping out 8 years of previous growth. And workers are essentially facing more than 2 decades of lost growth. And alongside that low growth, we also have high levels of inequality. Some striking stats from Torsten Bell at the Resolution Foundation that shows that the poorest fifth of households in France are 20% richer than the poorest fifth of households in the UK, and in Norway, they're 60% richer. So to improve wages and living standards, we need to grow the economy, we need to improve social inclusion, and to do that, we need to improve skills, increase employer investment in skills, and widen access to learning and training opportunities. And I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel to discuss these issues. To my left, I've got Patrick Craven, who's Director of Policy and External Affairs at City and Director of Policy, Strategic Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement at City and Guilds, Kath Sleeman, who is Head of Data Discovery at Nesta, and Anthony Painter, who's Director of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered Management Institute. Each of the speakers are going to speak for up to 5 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor for a Q&A session, so do have your questions ready. Without further ado, Patrick, can I come to you first? You're going to talk about the responsiveness of the skills and qualification system and how we can ensure that people have the flexible, adaptable skills that they need in the workplace.
Yeah, certainly, and thank you. And thank you as well for such an excellent session and convention today. I think it's come at a very timely moment. And I guess one of the slightly depressing opening statements is that we may well have to realise a high-skill, high-wage economy is simply to stand still over the next few years, let alone achieve any real sort of benefit. So I'm going to focus on talking about three aspects of this debate. The first thing I was asked to comment on was how we ensure the skills and qualifications system respond rapidly to the changing world of work. And I've just come from a session where we're looking at net zero skills and green skills definitions. And one of the observations that we made there was that in many ways, there's a number of parts of the ecosystem that need to move forward in tandem if we are to respond to some of the growing demands. And that includes awarding bodies like City and Guilds, it includes providers, whether they're colleges or training providers or others, and also includes employers in terms of employer demand, and then consumers downstream in terms of their demand for those sorts of services. So the 4 that I've pulled out here is, I think there's absolutely a need for industry employer informed review groups, but I'd caveat that by saying I don't think that is necessarily the way that it's currently enshrined with an employer-led system. With the best will in the world, when I speak to a lot of employers in the industry, they're interested in having a part to play. They don't particularly have the time or inclination to lead development of our skills and qualification system. So what they're more interested in doing is having more frequent engagement and intervention, and that probably plays into the kind of model that LSIPs should realise as they move forward in greater regional devolution. So I think there's something there about ensuring that you've got strong industry employer voice in that development equation. And they can signpost emerging demand and select additions or edits. The other thing is that I think there has to be a national and a regional dimension to this, because if we're talking about skills and qualifications, one of the things that gives qualifications their value is their currency. It's their trade value in the jobs market. And oftentimes that comes through consistent interpretation of what the outcomes mean. So you've got to be really careful as we move forward into greater regional autonomy that we don't fragment the skills system so much that actually what you end up with is things that don't have national currency. It's happened a bit already across the UK, where we have a rather bizarre situation where in what is actually very fluid borders in the UK in terms of labour portability, we have different systems emerging which therefore attach different sorts of values and outcomes to skills. So we need, I think, some sort of national steer with regional implementation. And I think regional dimension could set the pace and priority in certain areas as well. The third aspect, which we touched on in the session as in order, is about provider readiness. Don't underestimate the need to make sure that the provider ecosystem is ready to move as well. Because at the moment, the FE system, just like many other industries, is facing a dramatic shortage of skilled expertise. What they're finding in a situation where we've got a widening gap between public and private sector pay is that private sector pay is attracting skilled people into private sector jobs, and they're not staying in public sector education and training. So we need to make sure that the FE sector can invest in capital equipment and can invest and sustain in workforce, because they need to be able to keep pace. And the last idea, I guess, is this idea of modular design linked to regulatory approval. The problem, I guess, with one of the problems I find with getting old is that you tend to look at new initiatives and think, that looks surprisingly like something that I've seen happen before. And you have to kind of suspend your cynicism about those things and just recognise, well, perhaps now's the right time for it to happen, because certain circumstances have changed. And I look at this debate and say, it looks surprisingly like things like the qualifications and credit framework, in the sense of how do you deconstruct a curriculum and a system to allow it to be delivered in a more modular way. And I think we're going to have to embrace that sort of thinking and that sort of design methodology again, because the sorts of offer that we make available pre-19, I think will be different to the sorts of offer that we make available post-19 if we properly want to embrace lifelong learning. And that requires that more modular system. It's not helped by recent policy which has steered us towards a slightly more end-weighted, holistic form of assessment. And what I mean by that is 2 years of study with one big exam at the end of it, whereas previously we've had slightly more atomistic judgment along the way. So that's a kind of a view about skills and qualifications. The other question is asked was what role might micro-credentials and smaller modules of learning play, which plays back into that idea of modular design. And these are just some examples. So I think the first thing to stress is that the idea of micro-credentials, digital credentials, is not new. It's been around for a little while yet. It's starting to gain traction. City and Guilds use it extensively already. Most of our qualifications these days, we would issue a digital credential as well as a traditional paper certificate. We're also starting to look at how those things can be deconstructed and presented in smaller, more accessible ways. I think one of the challenges here is how you then start to standardise the definition of what's a badge, what's a micro-credential, what's a qualification. A badge, strictly speaking, anybody can issue. We could all get a badge after attending today at the convention, and that's great. We might need it for CPD, but it doesn't have much currency beyond that initial transaction. Micro-credentials and qualifications, what tends to happen there is often about the layers of external scrutiny and rigour that are applied to them that then give them their downstream currency. So layers of confidence that you wrap around something. The only difference there between a digital credential and a paper certificate is one is digital and one is a piece of paper that we would issue. There needs to be some common rules around the building blocks, and I think that's starting to emerge. Good work going on across Europe and in some other international domains where we start to set the standards for data transfer. But it has to be done at a time. It's still quite an immature market, so you've got to be careful that you don't stifle too much innovation by imposing rules too early on those systems. And there also needs to be a common agreement to think about the building blocks themselves, probably most easily referenced against things like GLH, guided learning hours, because people understand how to work in that kind of currency. So decide what's the smallest amount of something that's worth recognising, and how can that be then stacked together, and those things could stack into a bigger qualification over time. If we think about 2030 in terms of workforce, about 80% of the people that are required then are in the workforce now. So these are people who don't necessarily need to go back to education to do full year, 2-year courses. What they might need to do is to dip in and do a top-up of a module or an element of a qualification which fills a gap for them and just expands their repertoire in terms of skills. I think the other thing we need to look at is evolving the banks. So I guess my analogy would be, at the moment, I think there's a bit of a land grab trying to monetize the repositories for digital credentials. And it's a bit like saying, with our bank accounts at the moment, we have complete freedom to take our money and place it in whatever bank we want, and that's our choice. And the banks will offer us various additional services to entice us to do that. At the moment, digital credential banks don't always allow that portability, so there is a danger at the moment, I think, that you'll end up with a bank that you've created while you're in full-time education, maybe a bank at the next stage of your career, and then another bank at the later end of your career, and you're trying to reference 3 repositories rather than being able to combine all of those together. At the end of the day, the credentials belong to the learner. They don't belong to the institutions and the organisations that they've passed through. And I think it'll also be slightly different pre-19 and post-19, as I've mentioned before, that idea of building blocks and how people engage with those things. Pre-19 tends to be larger chunks of learning and amalgamations of activity. Post-19, and we start to think about lifelong learning entitlement, lends itself far more to far more atomised engagement. But that should be done in such a way that they can stack up into bigger things that have a higher currency as well. And lastly, how do we make sure people get flexible and adaptable skills? Again, this was touched on. I think there's a Resolution Foundation slide in the last session which gave a similar sort of spiderweb diagram in a slightly different context. But this is about the degree to which we're able to standardise curriculum. We did some work with Nesta a few years back where we were looking at the time over the need for what we were calling skills bridges, and this was about career transition. We were looking at it before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden it became a very, very much a reality. And this is a situation where your industry disappears overnight, and therefore the way in which you've defined yourself to date through technical or academic skills disappears and has no value. So you're then left with the situation of, how do I now portray myself in a way that I can go and seek other work in other occupations? And we started to look at these transferable employability skills that people could acquire, and started to work with systems like Skills Builder Framework, labour market information organisations, ONET, etc., and look at the way in which employers could maybe start to advertise their roles as skills, not as job titles, and say, the skills we're after are these skills. And therefore people could come at it and look at it and say, well, although I've worked in another industry all my life, did I know that I had the right skills profile that looks quite like the skills required of this industry? And it allows people to think in different ways. We've also, and a reference there, the work that we've done with Nesta, more recently with Greater London Authority, on these sort of employment bridges. Final thought on this, City and Guilds ourselves at the moment is undertaking a piece of work where we're actually doing a skills analysis of all of our workforce, because we're trying to get in mind the fact that we are going to have to flex our workforce far more in the future than we have to date. And we'd like to do it with our existing workforce and understand where their skills lie and where their journeys could go, rather than constantly having to go back out to the market again to get new people in. And I think that sort of resilience of workforce is going to be a key feature of a lot of our labour market going forwards.
Brilliant. Thank you. So lots of interesting, important points there about creating more flexible learning opportunities and ensuring people have those kind of flexible, adaptable skills for the labour market. You started by talking about employer voice and ensuring employers are involved, although not necessarily leading the skills system, which I think is a good note to come to you on, Anthony, because I think you're going to talk about the role of employers and how they can be incentivised to invest more in skills and workforce development.
Brilliant, thank you, Naomi. And I'll certainly cover that and maybe some policy reflections as well alongside that. We had the autumn statement this afternoon, so it's a good moment to have a conversation about these sorts of things. It used to be with autumn statements and budgets and things that you had to sort of wait a couple of days to see the embarrassing thing that was in there that was going to be used to beat the government, like the pasty tax or something like that. You now have to wait a couple of hours to see whether the financial markets have melted down or not. For anyone sort of renewing their mortgage, it's looking okay. It's a bit nervous, but it's going to be okay. But I listened to the statements on the way over here, and what was interesting about it, I mean, I have to say, given where we are, there's lots of stuff. It could have been a lot worse than it was. Let's be honest about it. But there's a really surprising omission for me, and that was the whole adult skills agenda. It was almost nowhere to be seen within the entire statement, or the supporting documentation. And given that the challenge is about long-term growth, and Paddy already mentioned the 80% of the 2030 workforce that are doing jobs currently, but given the challenge of growth and adapting to the industries of the future and navigating the stresses and tensions that public services have and so on, it's kind of an amazing omission, actually. And hopefully it's something that will be revisited in the budget next year, because I think it's a fundamental part of our national recovery. Michael Barber's going to have some responsibility for looking at the skills system in the round, and hopefully that's the vehicle which we can take a look at this, because we've got to move the conversation around skills to the centre of the sort of the policy and economic debate, it seems to me. There is an enormous role for employers in that process, but there's an enormous role for policy and the public conversation in that as well. So just to respond to the Autumn statement there, but there's three broader points that I'd like to touch on this afternoon. One is that we're wasting talent, and responding to the skills needs is part of that at an enormous scale within businesses, within organizations. Two, there are things that we can build on already that we're not pushing further or harder enough, like the apprenticeship system. And three, there are some big policy supports that we need to have the type of adult skills system that can deliver what we need as a country going forward. So first of all, on the wasting talent proposition. It's CMI. For those of you who don't know CMI, I'm sure most of you do, I hope most of you do. We're the Chartered Professional Body for Management and Leadership. We're in our 75th year. We exist to help promote and develop and improve the quality of management and leadership in the UK and beyond. It's our 75th year. We took a look as part of our 75th year body at work at diversity, inclusivity, and equality. And we published a report in June called The Everyone Economy, but it kind of ended up making a much broader set of points, and that is there are enormous numbers of missing opportunities within employers. There's a lot of sort of confidence about how well employers are doing. When you look at what they've actually done, they haven't put in place systematic plans to identify people with potential, to support them, develop them over time, to progress them through their career. So we're in a situation where we have hundreds of thousands of missing female, ethnic minority, people from less advantaged background, managers, that if we had, we would have far better performing public services and businesses. So in terms of the employer voice and involvement in the process, I think there has to be a recognition, first of all, that we're not doing anywhere near well enough to develop opportunities and progression amongst the widest array of talent within our organisations across the board. So that's a starting point. There is a role for policy in this as well, and a recognition that actually inclusivity and economic performance and productivity and innovation and public service effectiveness go hand in hand, and there's lots of evidence on that front. The second point I want to make is we need to build on what we have already. The apprenticeship system, by the way, you know, I'm sort of new to the sort of skills arena. I've worked in lifelong learning and skills for some time as a governor and in my sort of research and policy work, but I'm now directly employed in the sector for the first time. And it's been quite amazing to me to see there is basically what is a hypothecated pool of money of what's going to be almost £3 billion a year in the apprenticeship system. It's an extraordinarily fortunate position for a sector to find itself in, and that's not the entirety of the system. There's lots more. Obviously, the whole FE system goes alongside that. What employers invest goes alongside that. But to have that pot of money dedicated to supporting an aspect of the system is a really fortuitous situation to find ourselves in. And I think there's a lot of evidence that apprenticeships are doing a lot of good, standards-based apprenticeships in terms of increasing productivity. And in fact, we've just done some research that shows that productivity increases by about 20% in the private sector for a management apprentice. Over time, we forecast across the economy that £2 billion invested in apprenticeships will deliver £7 billion over a 10-year period to economic output and productivity. So there's a bedrock to build on there. I think we need to push the apprenticeship system further towards SMEs and younger people. There are ways of doing that, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion, but build on what's there and engage more employers in what is there and encourage them to secure benefits for their businesses and for public services by engaging in the system further. And the final point I want to make is on policy. The missing bit of the autumn statement today. There is far more coordinated action that can take place across government and with devolved administrations to elevate the importance of high-level skills to meet our future economic, social and environmental needs. It's a very fragmented agenda, lots of chopping and changing over time. You all know this, it's often talked about. But there hasn't been a government that's really sorted to get to grips with a coherent whole of the skills system and drive it using every policy and resource tool that it possibly can. Countries like Singapore do it very well. Germany, Switzerland do it very well. We don't. Secondly, there are things you can do in the tax system to encourage investment in high quality training, tax reliefs and incentives that go beyond the apprenticeship system. And thirdly, drive that apprenticeship system further, devolve some of the responsibility, bring in system players, and we've seen some of them in the likes of Travis Perkins, the London Progression Collaboration, people that can encourage SMEs to onboard onto the system, can support them through the system, and support apprentices most in need to complete. So those are just some of the policy directions that we might go in if we're really going to help employers get the most out of the skill system and help meet national economic and public service needs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anthony. And hopefully we'll have time to pick up on some of those points in the discussion. Kath, can I hand straight to you? You're going to talk about the work that Nest has done to measure how the demand and supply of skills is changing, and how that can inform decision making.
That's right. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you for the invitation to speak. And the first thing to say is that the work I'm going to talk about today comes from a whole group of very talented people. So I'm just the one talking. That's right. For the last 5 years or so, Nest has had a small stream of work that's been focused on improving labour market information. And in the UK, we have 4 primary gaps in LMI. So we have very little data on how workers move between jobs, very little data on skill demands and skill supply. We lack granular data on green jobs, and we don't have much data on job quality either. So our work aims to highlight these gaps and to show how machine learning and novel data sets might help to plug those gaps. What we also try and do is highlight some of the limitations of these newer methods in machine learning. So data gaps can exist for a whole range of different reasons. I've listed some of them there. One positive, though, to highlight is that many groups are now seeing this challenge and they're responding to it, and there's lots of solutions coming forward. So the reason we're interested in addressing these gaps is that potentially gaps in labour market information can dampen growth and productivity, and there's lots of mechanisms through which that can occur. So just to illustrate that, if we have very little information on how workers move between different jobs, then we can't tell job seekers about how other folks with similar skills have successfully transitioned into different industries. And if we don't have timely information on the skills needed by employers, then we can't tell learning providers about the new skills that they may want to incorporate into their courses. So these gaps in LMI, or labour market information, they can exacerbate skill mismatches, they can slow the rate at which knowledge spreads, which all in turn dampen growth and productivity. There are a couple of other side effects too. So not being able to tell people which jobs are green can potentially slow the transition to net zero. And a lack of information on on kind of skills more generally can mean that employers fall back on having to ask for degrees rather than skills, and we know that that can act as a barrier to greater diversity. So what are we trying to do to improve LMI? Well, our main effort is a pilot project called the Open Jobs Observatory, and this project involves collecting online job advertisements on a daily basis and with the permission of online job boards. So we extract key information from those adverts. That includes skills that are mentioned within the text of the advert, the location of the advert, and the salary on offer. So we started collecting in January last year, and we now have millions of adverts in our database. These are just some of the kind of preliminary insights from the observatory. It's still very much a work in progress for us. So the visual on the right there shows a very stylized map of the UK. For each region, the coloured bars indicate the demand for different skills, skills that were mentioned in adverts for positions posted in those regions. And it shows, for example, that London has greater demand for business skills and then relatively less demand for skills in construction. But there are a number of other angles that we can explore. We can look at the value of different skills by matching the salaries to the skills mentioned within the adverts. And we can also look at how skill demands are evolving over time. So I was just going to mention briefly 2 applications from the Open Jobs Observatory. The first is a project where we provided some insights from the observatory for the Sussex Chamber of Commerce. They were part of the Local Skills Improvement Plan Trailblazer program. And as part of that study, we explored transversal skills and digital skills, and we compared the salaries of those different skill groups, and we tried to identify the higher paying skills in each of those groups. The second application is a project in which we built an algorithm that automatically identifies which job adverts are for positions in green industries. So our preliminary work showed there that in addition to green jobs, we also have a number of non-green jobs in these green industries. So we really need a mix of both green jobs and non-green jobs to support those industries. And then just finally, a few other projects that we're working on. We've developed a data-driven skills taxonomy. We're also investigating the drivers of job quality through using millions of employee reviews that have been left online. We're going to revisit our work on green jobs to enrich our algorithm. And we're also keeping going with the work on that was mentioned earlier about measuring the theoretical similarity between jobs so that we can provide folks with information on job transitions. That said, though, there's still lots and lots of data gaps to explore. The largest gap is probably in relation to measures of skill supply. So we have very little information on the skills on offer through different courses just because of the sheer number of different providers and the lack of kind of standard ways in which we describe course content. There's also lots more to explore around green jobs. And then stepping back a bit and thinking more broadly, we should also look to develop mixed method approaches to capture skill demands in industries that aren't particularly well represented within those large data sets like job adverts. So we have a kind of mixed methods approach there. And then finally, as we see more career advice tools emerge that are based on algorithms, then it's really important that we consider setting some standards around those algorithms for ensuring that the limitations of the algorithms are really clear and kind of easy for everyone to understand. So that was a very whirlwind tour of everything we're doing at the moment to try and improve LMI. But yeah, would really welcome any questions.
Thank you. And I know an enormous amount of work has gone into that, and I'm sure lots of people here will be interested to interrogate the data kind of further and look at how we can use the tools within our work. So, questions from the floor. If you can raise your hands if you've got a question and say your name, the organisation that you're from, and try to keep your question concise. So I've got a question, well, I've got several actually, but I mean, you touched on it, Anthony, around kind of SMEs and their involvement with the kind of skills system, young people's access to training and development opportunities. I guess I'd be interested in hearing all of your perspectives on how we can ensure that we grow a kind of a high-wage, high-skill economy in an inclusive way, and what your priorities for doing that would be. Anthony, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think there are many different priorities that exist within the skill system. It's trying to meet a lot of demands around productivity, inclusivity, you mentioned it, social mobility, meeting the needs of industries of the future, and Kath talked about green industries there. And really interesting point, by the way, that a lot of the roles and skills within green industries aren't necessarily things that are green. By the way, the converse of that is outside of green industries, there are a lot of green tasks and skills that will exist within other industries as well. But I think we do need some clarity about which element of the skill system is doing what and for what purpose. Because I think we're overloading everything onto everything. We're trying to get the T-level system to resolve all of those challenges simultaneously. Employer-led training to resolve all of those challenges. Apprenticeships to resolve all of those challenges simultaneously. What there isn't at the moment is clarity around which parts of the system are designed to do what for whom and where. And I think there just needs to be a bit of a step back that involves employers, training providers, awarding bodies, policymakers, devolved administrations, that really thinks with some clarity about what we're doing in each of those arenas, and think about the progression and transition between and through them, and including the university sector in that as well. Because that's not what's clear at the moment. If you're an SME or you're a young learner, you look at this system and you either see confusion or just individual points of entry, right? So you walk through the door that's opened, or you see just confusion ahead. To go back to one of the examples I gave earlier, if you were a small business or a young person in Singapore, I'm not saying it's perfect, but, and they use a lot of labour market intelligence in this process, by the way, you'd see a bit more of a clear picture and multiple doors to work through, and you'd know the resources and tools that you would have at your disposal as you walk through that door, and you'd have some visibility about where that door might take you in multiple different ways. Right? So I think it is something about clarity and visibility, but that requires some focus within the policy and systemic world in order to design something which looks and feels like that.
Okay, great. Kath?
Yeah, I think where our work is kind of closest to that is probably on developing a skills taxonomy. So we've been calling for a number of years that we should have a UK skills taxonomy, and so we showed how through using job adverts we can kind of create the kind of a first version of that taxonomy that then needs to be improved with kind of expert judgment and kind of sectoral experts feeding in and kind of representing those sectors that aren't that we don't see within job adverts. And I think that would just give us a common language in which to speak about skills, and it would give us a framework on which to measure future skill demands. So it's about getting the skills taxonomy in place and then ensuring wide take-up and adoption, and then putting systems in place to monitor for the emergence of new skills as well. And that's the same for a number of labour market concepts, so green jobs, automation risk, quality of work. It's about agreeing on a common definition, providing some kind of breaking that definition down, if you like, providing lots of richness in it, and then creating a system to ensure that we can measure it not just not just once in a kind of one-off report, but we have an ongoing system to measure it. So every year we can tell people about automation risk or the number of green jobs or the new skills that have emerged or the skills that have become redundant. So I think we should think of it kind of building a piece of infrastructure almost. It's kind of data infrastructure.
Yeah, great. Brilliant. And Patrick, this point about kind of access to training and development opportunities. Our work has shown that graduates are 4 times more likely than those with no qualifications to undertake job-related training. People from lower socioeconomic groups are twice as likely not to undertake lifelong learning as those from kind of higher socioeconomic groups. How do we ensure that we are creating these pathways and enabling people to access training and development opportunities?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important debate, and I think that there's a couple of dimensions to it. For me, part of the issue about inclusivity is that one of the ways that you achieve and a perfectly laudable ambition to have a high-skill, high-wage economy, the reality is that not all of anybody's economy can ever be solely made up of high-skill and high-wage jobs, and so I think you have to recognise that mix that exists within any economy. But what you should never do is remove the bottom rungs of the ladder that allow people to get there. And I think there is a bit of a fixation at the moment in our policy whereby to force that agenda, some of the choice is being removed in areas that allows people to take those stepping stones to get there. You see it starting to emerge out of the rhetoric around lifelong learning entitlement. Lifelong learning entitlement, but only if you want level 4 and above engagement. Now, what happens for somebody of a certain age in their career who needs to take a sideways or a backwards step before they progress? Why shouldn't they have access to a lifelong learning entitlement if it eventually leads on to progression? So I think there's something about making sure you've got a sufficiently broad infrastructure in place to allow people to aspire to high-skill, high-wage economy and jobs. I think the point made about who tends to get access to those things, to be honest, the rot sets in mainstream education, because to a broad extent, what tends to happen is we have an educational system that rank orders groups of people, and it rank orders groups of people because there then is a selection process at the end of that period of learning. The downside of that is that what it does is it instills in a percentage of our society that actually education has no value. Education is not for them. Training is not for them. So why would they re-engage with those opportunities later on in life? Because they've never seen a value with that association before. And those that do excel from it are the ones that are most likely to step forward and want to get that further investment again. So I think there is a cycle to break there. I think with some of the investment being made in technical education at the moment, trying to raise the profile of it, apprenticeships for a much broader range of disciplines than we've previously seen. Some of that message is starting to get through, but it takes time. It's a deeply cultural issue in the UK about the choices that young people make, the opportunity that they're given. But essentially, if you demonstrate that people get a success from engagement with education and training, they are likely to re-engage with it later on in life because they see a connection with value. That's a good point.
Great, thank you. So I can see hand raised over at the back there.
My question was about migration and skills policy. Is there any scope for migration and skills policy to work more coherently together? I mean, before January 2020, employers could recruit from within the European Union. Now it's fairly easy to recruit for a level 3 job on the shortage occupation list. I mean, is there any scope for kind of inducing kind of conditionality? Should employers who recruit onto the shortage occupation list be also obliged to be involved in upskilling? What should we be arguing for these type of links? And how can policy on migration and on skills work more closely together?
Great, thank you. I think we've got one more question over here.
Hi there, yeah, it's Caroline from Birkbeck again. Sorry, guys. I just wanted to go back actually to a point that Anthony was making earlier on, which I think after today and listening to such a variety of speakers and organisations, this is a minefield. This is mental. And I mean that in the nicest positive way. But, you know, as a fairly educated grown-up, you know, even just navigating these conversations around the variety of opportunities and pathways that exists and we're talking about access, participation, widening participation. I was talking to Ilgan earlier on from Birmingham, is that we sometimes talk about the participants as if they're all on a level starting point. And we talk about groups of people as if they're all at the same point of making a decision. And I know we've come back to IAG several times today as well in various forums, but it's beyond that. One thing we haven't talked about today are role models. We haven't talked about mentoring. We haven't talked about regional examples that people can aspire to and look to and recognise as something they want to be a part of. And I think actually, before we start throwing people onto quite challenging life journeys of learning, there's actually a case to be made with a lot of people. You've got to take them on an emotional, a family journey, a buy-in journey. That sort of stuff does not happen overnight. I've worked with adults now for 25 years, and I've worked with them through employability programs, through educational programs, higher educational programs. And the one thing I've learned in these years, and I'm sure many colleagues will agree, is that they don't lack aspiration. They don't lack the intention to have a better life and improve their life outcomes. What they lack is the structure and the means to come to solid and measurable outcomes that they can then buy into, commit to, and see through. And I think that what we're sort of struggling with today is communicating and channeling all of this offer. And it's huge. And I think that we've all got really interesting regional knowledge bases and expertise that is grounded in the places that we work, the place, as you talk, people, place, and offer, etc. And I think that what we haven't done is come together and actually shared that in a more conclusive way so that we can take best practice out. But I do feel that I take away from today lots of exciting ideas and initiatives and, hopefully a positive future regardless of what the statement was today. But how do we take these people on this journey with us? We're in a very privileged position. I think we need to work a bit harder in trying to connect those two bases together, and then I think we'll start to see a shift in terms of the timescale of this happening, the meaningfulness of this happening, and actually people going, oh, this works. And I think that's the bit that we're struggling with at the moment. Sorry, that is my soapbox.
Great. Okay. Any further questions before I come back to the panel? Brilliant. Okay, so question there about how we take people on a journey, how we engage people with the kind of skills system, and the other about migration and skills policy. So who wants to start?
Well, I'm happy
Patrick.
to. I'll take the last question first if I can, because I'd find that probably easier to give a response to. So really, really well made point. One of the things I'd commend, if you can look out for it, and I know we've got reps from business in the community here today, haven't we, because they were on one of the panels earlier on. Business in the community as a group, one of their campaigns is looking at job coach skills exchange support. What essentially it does is that employees from their members reach out as mentors for young people who don't have support networks. And what that means is that, I was relatively privileged, not from an affluent background, but I had family and friends and network who could advise me and took an interest in what I wanted to do. Not all young people and not all adults have that network around them. And so what they do with this system is that they step in and provide that mentor support for those people who don't have that network around them. And it really is realising some quite extraordinary outcomes in the regions where they're doing it. So it's an example of how employers, industry, those more privileged could step in, could lean into that problem and do something about it. The question about migration and policy, I wasn't entirely sure whether you meant those that were engaging in migration should also then be demonstrating they're investing in their workforce as well, or whether there ought to be something shifting that made it more possible to bring in skills from other countries in high demand areas.
I think it was the former.
So those that are engaging with it should also be investing in. Okay, so I think that may well be a trade-off situation, that if people are looking to bring in skilled people from other countries, they are also... It played a little bit into the comment that I made earlier on today about the degree to which people are often looking at their own workforce to upskill and reskill their own workforce, as well as just looking outside. I think probably one of the difficulties in a tight labour market is a lot of employers look outside for a quick fix for a problem internally, rather than thinking about what's the opportunity internally to get people to that place. The point made about refugees, I think if we had more access to programs like ESOL, you'd probably go some way to resolving some of the Afghan and Ukrainian refugee transitioning to workforce, because often their barrier is language, it's not skills.
Great. Anthony?
Sure. Caroline, I'll come back to Jill's point in a moment. Caroline, points very well made. I mentioned our sort of everyone economy work, and we did a lot of sort of engagement with what is called, people with lived experience of discrimination and exclusion from lots of different perspectives, lots of different backgrounds. And one of the consistent messages that came across was the role of sponsorship and mentorship in helping them believe in themselves. And it wasn't always at school or college. It was often later on in their career where that happened and that support was given and someone took the time to help them navigate the system. So it's essential. I think devolution of some of this is part of it, because you described the people who know in institutions, the people that are in communities, the people that are engaging on a day-to-day basis, are on a more localized basis. One of the things that I think is worth considering is there needs to be, for example, in the apprenticeship system, far more student support, particularly those from less advantaged background, to help them to get to the end point of their apprenticeship. And I think part of the levy fund should be used for that sort of support as well, as it is in other parts of the system as well. So those are just some ideas, but I think you're asking all the right questions and making the right points. On Jill's point, it's really frustrating, isn't it, the way that migration and skills are seen as two alternative approaches to resolving the needs of the future. In fact, I read one of the subnational economic strategies last week that was almost saying, like, our option is either adult skills or migration. Well, no, it's both, and they have to sit together, which is why I like your idea of creating some conditionality around that. How that will work in practice, I don't know, but we've got to stop posing them as alternative strategies. We need a strategy for both. Refugees will have a right to stay here, and when Germany decided to take in 1 million refugees a few years ago, they made sure there were public systems to respond to that, so they were quickly sort of funneled into the training and skills system and the work support systems as well. So, I talked about wasting talent. There's a whole sort of pool of wasted talent there potentially, unless we catch them quickly and ensure that they can develop their skills or have their skills recognised in a way that can enable them to make a very quick contribution to their communities and get themselves put on a firmer footing.
Great, thank you. Kath, I'll give you the last word.
Well, to be honest, I really am not sure if I can offer any insights on either question. But I really feel for the second question, in terms of dealing with the complexity of the situation. It's something we struggle with. So if we want really timely, granular insights on skill shortages, then we need timely, granular information on both skill demand and skill supply. And one of the reasons, I guess, we all as a field focus so much on job adverts and skill demands is that they're relatively well organised and quite easy to access, if sometimes a bit expensive. But on skill supply, there's just so many kind of potential data sets and kind of to get your head around, and a kind of a lack of standardization, that it's really, really tricky. So we would really benefit from like a single database that had fantastically granular course descriptions, and then we could start to get a sense of the skills being supplied and then match those up with skills being demanded.
Great, thank you. And with that, we are out of time. For a really, really important discussion, and obviously we would have liked to have seen more on adult skills, lifelong learning in the budget, and we'll wait to see what comes out of the Barber review of skills. But I'd like to thank all of the panellists for your contributions. We will share the slides for anybody that wants to see those. But if you can join me in thanking the panellists.
Thank you.
Right, huge thanks to the panellists there, and congratulations to everybody in this room. You have made it to the final session of the day, and your reward is an excellent speaker and a really big set of topics to cover, again, just to finish the day with as well. Now, we talked a lot during the course of today about political instability and lots of change going on, and it's all very difficult to keep track of. One thing that we definitely know is going to happen is that there will be a general election within the next 2 years and 2 months at the latest. And so I think it's really important to hear what Labour's plans are and what Labour's take is on the labour market and how we can do better. And there were lots of very interesting and positive, from my perspective, announcements at the Labour Party conference just a month or so ago. So very grateful to Alison McGovern, who is the MP for Wirral South and the Shadow Employment Minister, for joining us today full stop, but particularly on what has turned out to be quite a busy day in Parliament. So we're very grateful, Alison, to you for your time this afternoon. So please welcome the Shadow Employment Minister, Alison McGovern.
Thanks, everyone, and it's really lovely to be here. I'm such a fan of the Learning and Work Institute. I wouldn't have not been here. Obviously, we had a slight date change in the beginning, and then when I saw the revised date and I realised the clash with the autumn statement, I had a bit of a panic. And then my team said, no, it'll be fine. If you get a train straight away, as soon as Jeremy Hunt sits down, you'll be absolutely fine. And then we realised that that involved getting a train, which has been a bit of an issue, but we did make it, so thank you so much. I have come straight from the Commons where Jeremy Hunt gave his autumn statement, although I think we are referring to it as a budget, and the distinction between the two has somewhere got lost in the midst of time. But so I'll just open with a quick reflection on that, if I may, and then I just want to talk for 10 minutes or so about the direction that we in the Labour Party want to take. And I hope that this is an opportunity, in some cases with some friends who are in the audience, not the first opportunity, but I hope this is an opportunity for you to give me some feedback about what you think of our direction and our ideas. This will be part of an extensive conversation that, as I say, in many cases has already begun, because we think that we can offer an alternative, but that alternative will be made much better by the skills, knowledge and experience of the people in this room. So thank you so much for having me. Today's autumn statement, as you can see, I have a copy of it here. Given how much money it involves, I think is quite a thin document. I think that it was right that the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has made a correction of the course that his predecessor, Kwasi Kwarteng, took in September. That so-called mini-budget, although again it involved a huge amount of public money for something referred to in such terms, was extremely damaging for our economy and made the wrong choice in who it prioritised and where money was redistributed from and to. So today's announcements are a shift away and essentially reverse the direction of what we were given 8 weeks ago. And the government, understandably, are attempting to persuade the markets that they know what they're doing. Well, fair enough. And, you know, I can understand why they're doing that. But what I'm looking for is something more than that, which is a direction for the future of our country. We've been through an extraordinary amount of turbulence from Brexit, a global pandemic, and now turbulence in, I'm afraid, a bit of politics, the Conservative Party, that's having huge ramifications for every family around dinner tables this evening. But where is the option for change? Where is the different course? And I worry that for every parent wanting their kids to grow up creative, well, enthusiastic about their future, worried about their mental health, but knowing that the talents of their kids could be realised, today's announcements involve no change for those parents, and for every town and city wanting to play their full part in rebalancing our country and not wanting to be dictated to from Whitehall, but wanting to set a course of their own. I don't think today's announcement involved any changes. And, I asked myself about rising destitution and how we're going to not just stop people needing to go to food banks, but shut those food banks down. And I can't see a path in today's statement. So I think for those with ambition for our country, today offered very little change at all. So I hope you'll allow me just to set out for a few minutes Labour's ideas about work and how we think we could create a mission for changing our country. It begins, I think, with an analysis of what's really going on in the labour market. Now, for the past few years, I have listened to Conservative Prime Ministers and Chancellors talk about unemployment being low. And I wish they'd been right about that. Of course, the ILO measure of unemployment is at a historic low. We know that. And this has been trumpeted from the dispatch box, described as one of the proudest achievements of the Conservative government. But today, at last, Jeremy Hunt did acknowledge that we have a measurement problem because inactivity is soaring. And when 20% of the people who are economically inactive nonetheless say they want a job, but they're not actively looking, I think to myself, well, how is that functionally different from the unemployment that I grew up with in the 1980s and 90s? It will have the self-same scarring effect on every town and place that has clusters of high inactivity as unemployment did on Merseyside when I was young. So I think our traditional interpretation of unemployment has been way too narrow. And I feel confident in that assessment because the Bank of England agrees. They say it's a genuine problem and that inactivity in the UK is much higher than in other developed countries. And we know that it is not a matter of chance, but rather that there are significant forces from ill health through to both physical and mental, through to the impact of care and other things driving these rates of inactivity. And as an aside, I think it's really important to think about this on a geographical basis, and the Centre for Cities and others have done excellent work on that. So I think we need a new mission for our country that I call real full employment. At the moment, we measure full employment as being the idea that everyone who wants a job has one. I don't think that's enough. I think we need to include many more people in our assessment and really set our ambition much higher than it is at the moment. And Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Secretary of State for DWP, has said that our ambition should be to have the highest employment rate in the G7. I think we should add to that ambition because at the moment we have this bizarre situation of rising inactivity at the same time as businesses are absolutely crying out for staff. And so every business knows that if you want to draw in more people, attract more staff, you've got to offer them, yes, decent pay, but also a really good and inclusive workplace. So having this idea of real full employment that draws in people who might have been written off in the past, to me that is a vision, not just that will help the public finances, not just that will be good for those people who might have been left on the scrap heap, who will be in work and living up to their ambitions they have for themselves, but I think it will be good for business too. So let me run through quickly 5 points where I think that Labour's plan for real full employment can be realised. And these, you're going to give me all your feedback about all of the things that I've missed. So this is just my starter 5 points. Okay, firstly, if we look at the rise in inactivity, we know that much of it is people who have become unwell. Now, yes, there are a lot of retirees who are becoming unwell as well, but if we look at that group of people who are leaving the labour market, there is a huge amount of ill health, and we have a real problem again with long-term sickness in the UK. So I don't think that you can separate out problems in the health service from our problems in our labour market. And that's why Labour has a plan, not just to increase staff in the health service, deal with waiting lists, but also to retain our staff who are currently under a great amount of pressure. And we think that by focusing on making sure our health service can do the job it was designed to do, that won't just improve people's lives, that will also help the health of our economy. I want to go further and really think about how at a local level we could integrate the NHS and DWP. How could we get sharing of data, information, expertise to make sure that when work coaches help and support people, they do so with the full expertise of the NHS? And there's some early pilots on these forms of integration, but I would love the advice of everyone in this room about how we really get that, to use the jargon, place-based approach. Second point, care. Did anybody notice the mention of childcare in the autumn statement today? You guys were in this conference, actually, so you might not have listened to it. But did anybody hear the mention of childcare in the autumn statement today? You won't, because there wasn't one. Didn't mention the word at all. Didn't mention the word at all. Barely mentioned social care, to be honest. And I don't need to tell people in this room the barriers that people face when they've got caring responsibilities. That's why on the Labour side, we've got a comprehensive plan for social care. And also, we've started to work towards a much better framework on childcare, initially on creating breakfast clubs so that parents can help bridge that gap before school so they have a better range and choice of jobs. And I could talk about how social care infrastructure is as important as roads and ports all day long, but I won't test your patience, Stephen. So the NHS, care, speaking of roads and ports, public transport, government's own research shows that restriction in public transport, especially bus services, in areas of lower employment is really harming the job choice that people have. The government found this out for themselves. And this isn't a matter of money. For too long in towns and cities outside of London, local councils and others, and now devolved institutions, have very little power on the kind of public transport infrastructure that's provided. Now, they can change some of that due to legislative change that happened in 2017, but it's so slow and so cumbersome. And we need to design our public transport services around getting people to centres of employment. If you live in Oldham, for example, and you don't drive, your options to get in and out of the centre of Manchester are very limited, much less get a job in Liverpool or Leeds. So until we give people that proper job choice, they will be consigned to poorer, less well-paid, less ambition-fulfilling work, and that's got to change. My final 2 points are about DWP itself. And I'm full of admiration for everyone who works for the Department for Work and Pensions, apart from the Conservative ministers at the top of it. I think they are full of expertise. My problem with the Department for Work and Pensions is the policy choices that have been taken over the past decade have made their expertise worth less to the country because it's not used in the way that it could be. And since William Beveridge and Eleanor Rathbone did their pioneering research into unemployment and found that one of the biggest challenges that working class people have is information about good jobs, where they are and how they can get them, and created the labour exchanges, that function of the state has existed to serve people, to show them how they can get a good job or a better job and move on and move up in work. Now, I wish this wasn't the case, but I do not believe that that is what is happening in job centres today. I think good work coaches who have expertise are being forced into a very narrow set of activities because of central government policy choices. And let me give you the worst example, the ABC principle, any job, better job, career. That's what Therese Coffey used to describe it as, ABC. Well, you know, in a country that's got businesses crying out for staff, labour shortages everywhere, yet we're telling people to take any job, means that instead of getting the best job or training to get that job, we're asking people to take jobs that are lower paid than they might otherwise do so. And that's bad for individuals, bad for families, and I think it's dreadful for our country. Worse still, the disconnect between our skills system and DWP, I think, is chronic. That's why Keir asked David Blunkett to have a look at our skills system, and I hope that people will have seen the Blunkett review, and it includes within it much more powers of collaboration for DWP with people who work in FE colleges and elsewhere. And he has suggested a right to retrain. So give work coaches the autonomy to use their expertise to help people not just take any job, but to get the best job for them and to really reach up and meet their ambitions. My final point is about devolving and involving. I know a lot of local councils that have had a really, really challenging decade. But I cannot give up on my hope that in the future it will be councils, combined authorities and others that don't just get dictated to about a levelling up agenda, but lead it and shape it themselves. And that's why I think when it comes to employment support, we need to put places in the driving seat. They can bring organisations around the table in order to do that. If we think about the people who are inactive at the moment, we're going to need disabled people's organisations at the heart of some of the commissioning of support services. We need trade unions to be involved, who see more than anyone else the consequences of a labour market where people on low pay have too little power. And we need to build up our policy-making capacity at the local level. Because let me tell you, unemployment, inactivity is different depending on where you live. Your job chances and choices are not the same in London and the South East as they are in my home city in Merseyside. They're different again in the North East. In Scotland and Wales, we already have devolution, and I think it's working well. And I don't see why someone like me, who has only been to Cornwall as a visitor, should be the driving force in the policy choices that are made for a place like Cornwall with its own challenges as a rural area, rather than the people who know it best. So I think our final principle for change on employment support needs to be that we will devolve and involve. Not take decisions from on high, but make them at the grassroots level. I think too often the decision has been taken that people just need to get into any job and that's good enough for them. And you'll forgive me being a Labour politician suspecting a bit of class prejudice there. I think that ordinary working people should have the right to fulfil their ambitions. That's why Labour has a plan for real full employment. I'd love your help with it. And that way, I think we can have a mission for job security, dignity, and the fulfilment of dreams for everyone in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And I think it's a breath of fresh air to be talking about a higher ambition and how we might deliver that and what that might look like in practice. I'm sure everybody will have lots of questions and thoughts and comments and additions to your list of 5, which will be a list of 50 by the end of this, I'm sure as well.
That's fine.
So I'm going to, whilst you're percolating and putting together your questions, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative just to kick off, and then I'm going to ask for a sea of hands to pick from. So I wanted to pick up on the last couple, I think, of your list of 5. So lots of those over 50s and people with ill health who've left the labour market, and the OBR today has basically said we don't expect them to come back because and then my addition to that is because nobody's doing anything to bring them back. But many of them are not on active benefits, and you talked about the role of Job Centre Plus. I think increasingly, as you said, there's some brilliant people in Job Centre Plus. Increasingly, it feels like a claimant management system rather than an employment system. Yeah. I guess my question, which links perhaps to your devolution point, is who's best placed to go and find those people who we need to get into work to get to your G7 ambition? You know, kind of how do we go and reach them in the first place?
Thanks, Stephen. So one thing that I didn't talk a lot about, but that I think is really important, is about where business is at. And I'm really heartened by the fact that in some ways, I think that the private sector is ahead of definitely where we are in politics. and I'm not sure about government from the inside, but the private sector is definitely ahead of us in politics in that we still sort of have a heated debate about having a fully inclusive workplace in Parliament in a way that is just not a question in business. And to take one example, menopause-friendly workplaces. I mean, I think that women for too long have put up with way too much on this. And I think that a really good way to involve and to attract women in their 50s and 60s would be to be loud and proud about being a menopause-friendly workplace, which is why a lot of businesses are doing it already. I mean, I think suggesting this in Parliament would be seen as deeply controversial, but it's just not controversial for a lot of businesses. That's just one example. Disability would be another. I think that businesses now know, particularly on mental health, if they want to be seen as an employer of choice, they have to be gold standard when it comes to disability inclusion. But if, you know, you look at access to work, it takes 12 weeks to get an access to work application agreed. So I think where the private sector is giving me hope that we don't have to accept what the OBR says as, you know, that's just the way it's going to be, that we can change it by having a workplace that's much more friendly to people in their later life. And I think, to your point about who's best placed to design it, you know, I've got a sort of job centre in my mind that is a bit like a Sure Start centre, but for your life at work. A universal service that's for everybody, but where people who need it most get the most out of it, kind of progressive universalism, where, you know, we could, I don't see why we shouldn't put job centres inside FE colleges, you know, if a local area felt that would help. But I suppose I just am a devolutioner by nature, and I think that people who are closer to places in policy-making terms are better able to make those decisions. So I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive about what the job centre of the future should look like. I would like to be led by local authority leaders, metro mayors and others. Like, to give one example of what's happening right now, I've been in Chester a lot recently because we've got a by-election. And in Chester city centre is doing really quite well at the moment, and the council want to have a space where DWP can come together with the health service and the council to offer people support services and provide businesses with a way to find staff at the same time. Sounds great. It's just a flat no from DWP. So I think even day one, week one of a Labour government, just by unlocking those things that people already know would help, but at the moment they are just not allowed to do, I think we could even immediately make a difference. And that's before you get to commissioning better support and all of that kind of thing. So I would love to design it all myself, but I just think other people are better.
Yes, a one-size-fits-all devolution, probably not a good idea. No, I agree.
Exactly.
So I've got a hand up in the front here, if there would be a microphone on the way imminently, and any other hands I can spot at the same time. And yes, oh, sorry, so we'll go to you first and then directly behind, and then we'll kind of work our way around.
Great, thank you. So we're in Birmingham, home of the Library of Birmingham Youth Hub. And to what extent are youth hubs, I know you've just said you don't want to be prescriptive, Alison, but to what extent are youth hubs, the best of which are strong local partnerships with DWP involvement, part of your plan to realise full employment?
Good question. Should we take the question just behind and then we'll answer those two, I think, please.
Hello, I'm Hannah. I'm from High Speed Training. First of all, I could reach across and kiss you when you when you mentioned that childcare was an issue, and it's such a shame that it's not mentioned today. We know that 33% of mothers, only 33% of mothers, have reported an agreed sort of special working arrangement, and only 26.3% of fathers. So what would you suggest to employers who are considering offering more flexi working opportunities? Because we know that's so important in ensuring we've got an active workforce.
Thanks. So on the youth hubs point, I've visited one of them, and I'll be very happy to visit more of them. I do think that the nation's young people also probably deserve decision making to be closer to them than Whitehall. I think it's an interesting acknowledgement that job centres are perhaps not going so well, that we decided to, or that the government decided to create a whole separate arrangement. And if we can learn lessons about how coordination and cooperation at a local level works well through youth hubs, then I'm absolutely here for it. And I would love to know about more of the learnings. I suppose what I worry about is that it's a product of failure rather than a design for success. On childcare and flexible working, I mean, this seems to me to be a huge challenge. And as part of getting to that highest employment in the G7, there are some big structural shifts that we have to embrace, and flexible working is one of them. We need to understand childcare and adult social care as economic infrastructure that we cannot live without. And then we need all businesses to do what the best businesses are doing, which is to say, our staff are so important to us that we recognise that their families are important to them. And therefore, we will work flexibly in order to empower them to manage their lives in a way that is not stressful and works well. Of course, we all know that there's constraints in different job roles again, but I've seen it done. I've seen businesses have a history and culture of working a certain way and realizing, no, we've just got to change. I remember when I was on Treasury Select Committee and Nikki Morgan and I were doing this investigation into women in finance, and we had a senior bank leader come and tell us that he was so committed to showing that you could work flexibly and be, sometime in the office and sometime at home, that even though he had no caring responsibilities, he did it just as a point of leadership to demonstrate to everyone in the business that that was a perfectly normal way to be a leader in a finance institution. And so I know it can be done. We have a green paper on rights at work that targets those rights to flexible working as an area where we would wish to extend because of this. Good businesses are doing it already, so let's make sure that those other businesses are catching up.
Great, thank you. Now, there was one question at the front. I think I saw a hand over here somewhere. Have I? Yes. So we'll kind of take those two questions together, if we could, please.
Clifton from Shore Trust. Thank you for your comments, and really interesting to hear sort of the direction of travel of you thinking. I suppose a challenge first and then a suggestion. I think from job centres' point of view, one of the challenges of getting people to go into job centres is the fear around they are on one hand potentially controlling somebody's benefit and sanctioning that, and you're expecting the same person sat in front of them to give them advice and guidance on the future. And it's how you overcome that problem of them doing a dual role in that respect. And I would say that your link to health really is important, and I think from a charity who works a lot with people with health and disability, with the largest IPS provider with the NHS, where we've not got the involvement of DWP, we're working with clinical professionals, actually working with them to move them into employment without actually the involvement, although they are getting benefit. So the assumption you need them all to work together may not be true, and could you potentially just have job centres doing the benefit and actually work with the health service and local authorities to actually give the support?
Thank you. And Scott?
Yeah, hello. Scott Park in the Institute of Employability Professionals. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not an economist like Stephen, but it strikes me as economically and commercially crazy that we are not tackling the elements of bringing people back into the labour market, particularly those over the age of 50, who may well be, and I expect so, taking equity out of houses, taking pensions early. And I appreciate, and it goes beyond the normal political cycle, but what happens in 8-10 years' time when the money runs out?
one of the things in politics that you always have to learn to do is to think beyond the end of your political career, which is not always what people do, but very important. Richard, thank you for your comment there. I think that you hit the nail on the head, really, about my big worry about job centres at the moment, which is when the first person you see when you walk into a job centre is the security guard, and then the next person that you see, you're probably going to see for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and they're mainly there. I want to be careful here because I think a lot of work coaches do a really great job. But I think that national policy has driven towards compliance, not support. And one of the reasons why I think that contains the answer, in that I think that the way that you give people really good quality support is that it understands their barriers and it's tailored to them. The lesson from getting lone parents into work was that we specialised. People who in job centres worked with lone parents knew and understood life as a lone parent. And the same on disability. I think we did better when we had more specialisation. So I think we need to rethink how we build that relationship of trust between the citizen and the state in a job centre. Do you need DWP to be involved? Maybe actually the NHS can do it all. Well, the first thing I would say is, DWP has a huge amount of information. Universal credit as a system has many flaws as the way it's delivered at the moment, but one of its potential benefits is to help us understand the journey that people go on into work. And through the data from universal credit, we might be able to get much more evidence about what actually works in terms of support. So I think that there is a very important role for a Labour department to play, the Department for Work and Pensions, in understanding people's lives at work and how we can best help them. And so I think DWP should be involved. And I think at the moment the NHS has really grasped the fact that it cannot really reform itself without tackling the social determinants of health. Well, number one social determinant of health, in my opinion, is your life at work. So actually, I think it's got to be a partnership across government. But as I say, always would say I want to be led by people who know their area best. And on 50-year-olds, I think you're right to be worried. I think the big question for us as a country is, are we going to accept this as our fate? I think the answer has got to be no, for the reasons that you mentioned economically. But also, I come back to the point I made earlier, which is this is not geography neutral. It's not like there's the same amount of inactive people everywhere in the country. This is going to be dreadful for certain towns and certain places in our country. And we know that that has significant social and political consequences. Hence why our mission should be real full employment. We give up on nobody, and we give up on no place. That has to be our mission.
Now, I think I've probably got time to sneak in a last quick question or two, if anyone has got one. I feel like I've been a bit biased towards the front, so we'll go for the middle. And is there anyone? Oh, yes, and there's one at the back there as well, I can just about see. So we'll take those two.
Thank you. My name's Ornella Nisio. I'm from Maximus. We agree with your approach in terms of collaboration is key to solve some of the employability problems regionally. We published a report last month called Collaboration Works, and it outlines our community partnership network that we deliver. And I just wanted to know, what role do you think that the private sector has to play in this kind of collaborative approach to employability? Because I think there are some expertise there as well that could help support your agenda.
Thank you. And I think, have you got a... Yes, excellent.
That's a great question. Mine's more of a request to you. A lot of people in this room might have missed this, but please could we ask that we stop lumping the southeast with London? We've come up from Kent today, and Kent consistently is listed as having the highest levels of deprivation, the lowest levels of social mobility, and we have a high number of coastal communities in the southeast who we know have different health and well-being and employment challenges nationally, and we're all losing talent up into London. So that's really just not a question, just a request when we're thinking about levelling up, not to forget about the counties that surround London.
Thanks. On the private sector, yes, absolutely. It comes back to that point about the knowledge that comes from the private sector and the understanding about how to build workplaces. And I know that there's a lot of expertise, and I will have a look at your report, because I think that I've got thoughts and ideas that come out of experience, but evidence is even better. So if we can work together to make policy on the basis of that evidence, that I think was more likely to be successful. So absolutely, we want to be involved and be talking to and be listening to people who've got real experience. So please do get in touch, and I'll have a look at your report. It's funny, on the London, the South East point, I mean, London shouldn't even really be lumped in with London, because there are parts of London that have absolutely dreadful employment statistics. It's just different. And I would love to talk to you about Kent to understand a bit more. And this is why I think that my gut instinct to devolve and involve, it comes out of knowing that I wouldn't be the best person to design services for people in Kent, because the people on the ground have that fine-grained and detailed knowledge. So can we use that knowledge, would be my request. How do we create structures within government that mean that that knowledge from Kent can design support that helps those people there, based around the employment mix and opportunities that there are in Kent, based on the history and the experience of the economy in Kent, and to try and offer people a better future. I think that would be the best way to go about it. But from a sort of regional imbalance point of view, there is strong evidence that there is a how to describe this, core periphery problem, in that for those industries that are most connected to London, geographically, they have easy access to government. There's a kind of policy making that happens there that has supported the development of those industries. For places that are not close to London, there's been a problem. If you think about the impact of deindustrialisation on manufacturing areas in the northeast and the northwest, for example, we've had this problem for a long time. But I would say, let's not replicate these problems. Let's build up our local institutions so that they're able to help people where they are with that knowledge that they have.
Great. Now, sadly, we're out of time, so we need to let you go. I think we've added to your list, but not massively. And I think I just add a couple of things. So one is, it's very easy to get depressed at the moment. It's like the worst time for living standards since the Big Bang or something or other. It's probably the latest stat. But actually what you've set out is a vision for doing better, and we can do better than this, and that's what we've been trying to talk about all day as well. And then secondly, what you've got in this room is a whole bunch of people who really want to help you with that vision and some of the questions that you're thinking about as you're planning for a Labour government. So anything that we as the Learning and Work Institute can do to help facilitate that or bring people together, we're very happy to do. But I know everyone in this room is very appreciative of your time this afternoon, as I say, particularly busy day, but also the vision that you've set out and how you've said you want to work together with people. So can we thank Alison?
I really appreciate that, Stephen, and I would also just like to re-emphasise that anyone here has an open invitation to drop me an email, get in touch, send me your data, give me the benefit of your expertise. and I would be really pleased to engage.
There you go, spreadsheets galore on the way.
Oh, love a spreadsheet, love a spreadsheet.
You're amongst friends here. So thank you for that, we're very grateful. And that is the end of the day. I'd like to thank all of the speakers that we've had during the course of today, all of the sponsors, supporters and exhibitors, including in particular the Shore Trust as the lead sponsor as well, who have helped to make this happen basically. And of course all of you for coming along and for engaging so thoroughly in what have been, I think the civil service term would be wide-ranging debates during the course of today, so we've covered a lot of ground. I'd also just like to thank the Learning and Work team. I think I'd forgotten quite how much work goes into putting on these things in person. And the team who you've seen around here and around outside as well have worked just so hard over a period of weeks as well as today. So could you give the Learning and Work team a round of applause? Now, so the presentations will be sent via a link to you next week, and recordings of the keynotes and panels will be uploaded onto YouTube, I think. So so you can watch it all again. You can have the day all over again. So we'll send you the link as well as a feedback form, because we really want to think about how we run next year so it's even better. I've thoroughly enjoyed today. I hope you have. It's been great to see everybody as well as have all of these discussions. And I guess the last thing to say is that your reward for making it through to the end of the day is a networking reception with a drink if you wish, and also a chance to hear from a couple of people who've really benefited from brilliant employment and skills support as well. It's really inspirational stories. So please do join us if you can, round in the exhibition space. I think I'm pointing in the right direction. I may not be. There you go. I was pointing in the wrong direction, so ignore that. It's out there. So please do join us for a drink if you can. Thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you next year.